speak here. I probably have a slightly closer connection with Tex Cauthen than some of you might imagine, so I'm not just quite an ad hoc speaker. Certainly when Steve was over in the UK in Newmarket, I met up with Tex a couple of times. I doubt if Steve remembers me, but he might remember my younger brother, who was the plater for Henry Cecil and played many of the great winners that Steve rode at that time. So as I say, there is a connection, and I'm really honoured to be here. I'm particularly honoured as well to be asked to speak here at the world famous Gluck Centre, so it'll go on the CV, you know. So thank you for that. Now, I'd better get the technology going and open us up somewhere. I hate to have to do this, but I don't really need these, of course. But
pull it from the bottom there. Just hover over there.
Huh?
Just over there.
Oh, I see. There we are. Okay. Good. Right. Let's go. So, as I say, or it has been said, this is my the title of my talk: Hoof Foal Development from Fetus to Maturity. And as Dr. Tobin already said, I've done that rather strange thing late on in life. I went and like many farriers, I left school at the age of 16. In fact, I would say I wasn't actually expelled from school. I was just asked if I would consider not coming back. And so I took the hint. Anyway, and you know, I would have to say I came from a family of farriers, and I didn't really know what to do. And I showed that lack of imagination in that after at least 4 generations, I just said to my father, "Can I come down the forge?" He was very surprised, but that I even considered it, but it was only because I couldn't think of anything else. I would say within days I was absolutely intrigued and fascinated with the job, and that has stayed with me ever since. And I had an opportunity about 7 years ago. We had a degree in the UK for farriers, part-time, so it was for farriers that are still working, and that was a wonderful opportunity through the University of Central Lancashire. You can probably see the logo there, UCLAN, and the college Myerscough, where we have one of our 3 farrier schools, so that's the link. So I did a degree, and I'm afraid I got the bug. And even before I'd finished my degree, Professor Riley, who I think some of you may have heard speak at the International Hoof Care Summit a number of years ago, said to me I should do a master's. And before we even got through that process, it sort of ended up as a PhD. And one of the main reasons was that if I did a master's as a part-timer, that's 3 years, that's 2 years, and then if I did a PhD, it's 6 years. Whereas if I went straight in, I saved 2 years. Now, when you're my age, saving 2 years is actually quite a good plan. So that's what I did. And I was hoping to come to the States officially as doctor. Actually, I'm not officially yet. The university said I have passed, but with small changes to my thesis. I'm told that's the best you ever get. No examiners ever accept your thesis and say that's great, we'll accept it like that. So that's where I'm at. But I've chose, of course, again, with showing a lack of imagination, not to study anything other than the horse's hoof. And whereas at the start of my career I concentrated a great deal on horses in training, so on the track, plating, as my career developed, I moved more over, shall we say, to the gentler side of stud farms, where there is a different, shall we say, atmosphere when it comes to the horse's foot. So I decided that that's what I was going to study. That probably means I sent the slide backwards, doesn't it? Oh, here we are. Okay. So I can't present 6 years' work, but I'm going to pick some of it. I hope it interests you. If anything, I'm even more in awe of the horse's hoof and what it has to put up with and how developed it is. It has been described by another academic as a miracle of bioengineering, and I think the horse's hoof is certainly that. So we're going to look at a little bit of the physiology of the hoof, the angles of the digit, in other words, how those angles change in the development of the foal, hoof renewal and hoof compression. I'm just going to look at hoof renewal here today, in other words, how quickly the foal grows a new hoof. And then I want to look at how loading, in other words, the way the horse bears weight on various aspects of its hoof, how the foal does that and how that alters foot conformation. So I said we'll start early. This is a 23-day-old embryo, and you can't tell it's a horse. It is a horse, but if there was a human embryo up there, it would look just about the same. But we can see no hind legs yet. There's a picture somewhere down the corridor that Emma Collins showed me, only 43 days, so 20 days after this one, where it has the hind legs. The horse does not wait until it's born, the thoroughbred certainly, to become fast. It does everything fast, even in the uterus, I can tell you that. So I'm having a job finding the pointer here. Okay, so we have this front limb bud, but there's not a lot else that tells us that this is even really going to be any sort of animal. Nevertheless, at about 2 months old, I think this is 65 days, it is undoubtedly a horse. And we know it's a horse not because of its head shape, because again, many mammals would have a similar head shape. In fact, looking at it, it almost looks reptilian. We know it's a horse for one reason. It only has a single toe on each leg. Now, there are many things that are extraordinary about the horse, but it's about its only unique feature. And when I say the horse, of course, we've got to include the donkey and zebras in that. So the horse family is a one-toed animal, and of course that has led to it being an extreme athlete. At over a distance of 20 miles, no other animal on earth beats it, on the land I should say. Bizarrely, at 26 miles, human beings are quicker than the horse. Although I often look in a mirror in the morning and I think to myself, could I still beat a horse over 26 miles? So I think we're comparing athletes with athletes. So the horse is a remarkable thing because it is in the top 10 fastest animals on earth, and that's forgetting that we put somebody on its back. But it's also the quickest over a distance of 20 miles. So from a stamina point of view, it has that remarkable characteristic. And that's helped greatly by this single toe. Just another 20 days later, the picture we've got there, which again is a fetus, and it's a radiograph, and you can see bone formation, not just the spine and the skull, but also beginning within the limbs, and actually you can just about make out that the distal phalanx is there, starting to develop within the hoof. So remarkably quick. But the thing that strikes me, and it's not a unique feature, is that of course the horse, now that is a $10 fine, isn't it? A $10 fine that goes into the pot. That's my first pint. Okay. The thing that is remarkable, though, about the horse, but not unique, is that it stands up. And of course, those of you that breed horses and thoroughbreds, I'm sure it's the same here as in Newmarket, if that foal is not standing and suckling from its mare within an hour, then the veterinary surgeon is called. So all large herbivores tend to do this because they have to escape predators. But it is still a remarkable thing when you think that human children lay on their backs and scream for about 8 months. Now, I have 4 children. They are pretty much grown up now, but I don't know this for a fact. I was told it by my wife. I managed to avoid them for about the first 13 or 14 years of their life. And that, I would recommend that to everybody. So let's look at the hoof wall structure. As I say, this is a remarkable piece of engineering. It is the integument. Integument is what covers all organisms and protects them from their environment or intermediates with the environment. But it is adapted at certain points. So of course we have skin, Reptiles have scales, birds have skin and feathers, and horses basically have skin, but just like our fingernails at certain points, integument is very adapted. But the horse is far more adapted, its hoof, than our fingernail. This is a slice through the hoof of, quite clearly, a foal that sadly passed away, and I had to collect a lot of those for my PhD. And it's sliced midway through the hoof, so we're actually looking down the hoof structure. This would be the pedal bone, that distal phalanx within the hoof. These are the lamellae, which suspend the horse within its hoof capsule, and here we have the hoof wall. And we can immediately see that this is not just a solid block of tissue of hoof horn. It's actually full of horn tubules, and we're going to look at those in a few minutes. Now it grows from the papillae at the coronary band. Immediately the hair finishes, there is a conversion to papillae, which are these little projections, and you can see it there peeled back again on a dead foot. And these are the papillae here, and off each one of those, this tissue, this tubule, is developed. This is diagrammatically what's going on. So this is one of those tubules, okay, a two-dimensional representation. And so this is producing horn off the side. I think farriers that look at anatomy and often learn it tend to think that the horn tubules are just developed off the tip here. They're not. They're growing out this way, and I'll show you why that's important. This is where it's getting a little bit nerdish, but in between each one of these papillae, the intertubular horn, in other words, the horn that isn't tubules, is developed. Now the reason this is important is that these are developed at almost right angles to the horn cells there. And if we look at the horn cells, what happens is horn cells are live when they first develop. So they are tissue, no different than other cells in our body, but they rapidly undergo keratinization, to put it simply. So they die, and we can see they start to shrink and become squamous, which only means squashed. But the important thing from my point of view from the structure is these keratin fibres, which form almost a scaffolding across the cell, which gives the hoof horn its great strength, they come to lie more in alignment with the squashed cell. So they lay that way. So if you think about this, these cells are laying one way, are laying flash at 90 degrees to the way the horn's coming down, but these are growing, are produced out and then follow down. So that means that although tubular cells and intertubular cells are actually very similar, they're actually, it's like producing bricks or tiles and laying them at different angles. And from that point of view, that gives incredible strength to the hoof wall. The other thing is these desmosomes here, which Professor Pollitt in Australia describes as spot welding, something most of us can understand, are attaching all those cells. And again, it slightly misrepresents things to do a two-dimensional picture. This is happening all round each one of those cells. So it's attaching to the cell above it, below it, to the side of it, to the back of it, and to the front of it. And in that manner, the hoof becomes extraordinarily strong. So Nickel, who was a German scientist in 1938, he proposed that the tubules actually were produced in this spiral-like manner, and therefore they were able to compress. Now I would have to say that I think Nickel was probably doing that thing that most scientists, including myself, are in danger of doing, which is finding the thing that you want to find. And in fact, nobody else has actually really been able to see that or show that. But definitely, those horn tubules do have a circular pattern. Whether it's spiral and whether it's telescopic is another matter. But what we do know about horn tubules, because we have to ask the question, why are they there, is that they add stiffness to the hoof wall. Now, the hoof wall is quite flexible, especially nowadays with high-speed photography. We can see that, high-speed videos. We can see just how much the hoof flexes with every step the horse takes. So it needs to be flexible, but quite clearly it needs to have a resistance to bending, otherwise it would just bend too far and snap. And that's what horn tubules add to it. And larger cylinders, so the larger a cylinder is, which is basically what horn tubules are, they add greater stiffness. They certainly resist hydration, and so, funny enough, I was looking at a hoof just before I came out of here, and I'm sure all the farriers would recognise this. Sometimes you get poor quality hoof, and in the wet weather, you actually see these little fine, almost straw-like strands on the hoof. Well, that's because you're actually looking at the horn tubules, and the rest of the hoof has just disappeared. So the horn tubules do resist hydration, and it isn't so much the hydration coming from below. The hoof is more hydrated towards the sensitive tissue. So from the inside to the out, it's more hydrated. And so if it's more hydrated, it has to have some resistance to that so it doesn't fall apart. So we can see that these horn tubules are a different size. So we know quite a lot about the hoof wall. As I've just shown, we know that it has a tubular structure. We know that the body weight's suspended within the hoof, and of course that's always worth remembering. It's very easy to get into the mode to think that the horse's hoof works in the same way as our foot sits in our shoe. That is not what is happening here. It is not that the skeleton of the horse, the pedal bone, sits in the hoof. It's actually suspended from the inside by those lamellae, and you can just see the tips of them there. And of course we know that in cases of laminitis, when they fail, it has catastrophic effects upon the horse. It's viscoelastic. What does that mean? Well, elastic is, for example, a flexible ruler. If you bend it and let go, it springs back to its shape. If you take a tennis ball and squash it, it returns to its shape. So that's an elastic response. A plastic response is if when you get Play-Doh, for example, and you squash it and it stays squashed. Now, the horse's hoof actually has both of those qualities, and therefore it's described as viscoelastic. So at times it can be squashed and bent out of shape, but at other times it recoils. So it's quite a complex, it has quite a complex material properties. And we know it's tough and durable. Now, like many farriers, the later part of my career, I was just dealing with hooves with problems. And you get in this mindset that there's always a problem. And I've thought about it since that, in actual fact, for most cases, for most of the time, the hoof is extremely healthy and does its job really very well. It is a very, very strong material, and so that's its toughness. It's durable in that, in a mature horse taking about a year to grow that hoof from top to bottom, the hoof is just about as tough when it reaches the bottom of the ground as when it left, as when it was generated at the coronary gland. So that's important to remember that, and when you think that it's flexed every time that horse takes a step. If you ask somebody in engineering, somebody, should we say, in aeronautics and designing a wing, they would find that that hoof's ability to do that is extraordinary. And in fact, some people in the laminates industry do study hoof horn to find out why it just has this incredible durability. Now we know it produces growth rings, and I have this picture here, and this was a foal of perhaps 7 or 8 months, and its mother had been ill, and its mother being ill did produce a growth ring on the foal. So events in a horse's life produce growth rings, and of course they grow down, they descend the hoof at the same point, so all 4 hooves have a growth ring. We can see that when a horse changes environment, if it comes out of training, it usually produces a growth ring. If you change the diet, if it's ill, if it moves from one place to another, it often produces a growth ring. So events in a horse's life produce this record on the horse's foot. And of course it constantly regenerates. It doesn't actually start growing until the foal is born, which is a pity really, because that would mean for us farriers, we would have a job, wouldn't we, on the first day of the foal's life. But it actually starts growing when it's born, which again is a remarkable thing. and it grows for the rest of its life. Now, of course, there has been suggestions, and there's been 1 or 2 papers that look at the fact that it grows fast when it's young and it slows down throughout its life, and that's part of my project to look at that. So Bidwell and Bowker, Bob Bowker is a very well-known professor from Michigan University. Laurie Bidwell was one of his PhD students, and they said that young foals have symmetrical and paired hooves. So symmetrical, in other words, as an individual, if you drew a line through the middle of it, you would have a mirror image. And that they're paired, so the left looks like the right. And I concur with that. So here's the interesting thing. How many of us have a horse with a perfectly paired feet at 3 years old and perfectly symmetrical? All right, so one of the questions I needed to ask was, so what happened? What happened to our perfectly paired, symmetrical foal's hooves? And that in itself is a question. So one of the studies I did was to look at cadaver foals, and I had to get permission to get these foals from, they're all collected at and taken to one abattoir in Newmarket, and fortunately that's owned by the Jockey Club. They gave me permission to collect these hooves. And so I basically was looking at, I decided I wanted to look at the fetuses, so late term, so from about 10 months, 1 month before birth, and I only wanted to go up to 4 months. My whole project, with one exception, was looking at pediatric foals. So in this very rapidly growing period of a foal's life from birth to about 4 months. So I wanted to look at epidermis width and density of those tubules, and I made the assumption, and I think it's a fair assumption, that the width of this epidermis, in other words this hoof wall, would increase from a 10-month fetus to a 4-month-old foal. And obviously I had to develop methods for counting this and for measuring it. And this is a slide, and actually it's only times 20 magnification. Now by the time you're looking at it, of course it's far bigger than that. But actually the horn tubules in a foal's foot are just about visible. They're barely microscopic, and it might be that nowadays I have to put those on to see them. You can actually see them on a trimmed hoof. You can see that tubular structure. So I was quite interested that there's been quite a few papers on mature horses, but nobody had looked at the foal. And I just wanted to see whether it was different. That was the first thing, just some fundamental data. So obviously measuring was fairly easy, in that I have this calibration here. 1,000 microns is 1 millimetre, so I'm sure, like you're in about as confused state as we are in the UK, in that even when I was at school, we were taught in metres and millimetres, and yet I buy my steel in inches, and I drink a pint down the pub. And don't anybody let you tell you that it tastes better in a half litre. The only way to drink beer is by the pint. Okay. So obviously I've just to convert, if this is 4 mil, 25 mil is an inch. So this is a fetal hoof, so it's quite narrow at this point, the hoof. So what did I find? Well, what I found with my epidermal width, so this thickness, is that, sorry, I should have said that I measured medial. I took my sections from the medial, or the inside hoof, the toe, the dorsum, and the lateral side, so the side facing the outside. And I did this for all my studies. There is a reason on one of the studies why I couldn't come back to the heel, so I decided to stick here, here, and here. So all of them you can see medial, dorsal, lateral, and all my graphs go this way. So this looks pretty even. You wouldn't be surprised that the hoof at the toe is wider than at the quarters. But here's the difference. In mature horses, in mature thoroughbreds where that's being done, that's not the case. It is certainly thicker at the toe, but then it becomes, the next thickest part is medially and then laterally. But you can see that's a very symmetrical graph. So our foals, even at a microscopic level, are very symmetrical in the early days of their life. When we looked at the density, you could see the density of these horn tubules is actually, again, very symmetrical from medial to lateral. These are identical densities. But the toe is less dense. So you might say, well, why would the toe be less dense? And if you remember I said about the structure, well, here's a peculiar thing, that horn tubules, they get most studied because they look different. But actually, they're not as good at resisting cracks as intertubular horn. I have never seen a foal with a crack, a young foal with a crack, at the side of its hoof. They get them at the dorsum, at the toe. So there at the toe, there's less density. And the only way I can explain that is if the tubules are less dense, that means there's a higher density of intertubular horn, and maybe that's the foal's way of resisting cracking. But again, this is very symmetrical. In mature horses, it's not symmetrical. There's a greater density in this area. So they do differ again from their mothers. They differ from 3-year-olds in training. So I also looked at the size of these horn tubules, and again, the reason I looked at that is that the actual property does change with size. There is a change in the tubule strength, and again, for the third time, we get a very symmetrical graph here, but the larger horn tubules are there at the dorsum. And again, where does the hoof flex most? I know it may tend to open more, but it tends to flex at the dorsum like this with each step, and therefore there probably needs to be a resistance to that flexion there at the toe. And again, this differs from mature horses. So there's a pattern emerging of our foals being very symmetrical compared with mature horses, which are not symmetrical at all. So our conclusions were that with aging, the width increases, well, no great surprise there. Density decreases. So though there are more horn tubules, there is actually less density than when they're young foals. And the diameter of these horn tubules increases with aging. So we get more horn tubules, we get them larger, and the density decreases. And so from this I can conclude that pediatric foals, and the term pediatric, I never heard it for years, but it seems to have popped up of late, of describing foals from 1 month to 4 months of age, is that they have a very symmetrical hoof wall, which is different from mature horses. All right, let's move on to, I did a radiographic and morphometric study because I was quite interested in this changing angle, not just of the dorsal hoof wall, but also of the whole pastern. And this is pretty typical. I think most of you that breed foals would recognise this sort of conformation at 12 hours old, and nothing at all to be concerned about. We shouldn't be surprised that they're a little bit lax. There's not a lot of exercise goes on in the uterus for 11 months. So, as I say, it's remarkable that they stand up. We shouldn't be surprised when they're a little slack. And also you would recognise this, that the same foal at 2 weeks old now has a far stronger conformation. By the way, these blue dots, if you wonder where they're coming from, it was one of the ways all the foals I studied, I had to find a way of calibrating the size of these hooves. So if you put a sticker on there, then it's a bit like, who knows from a photograph how big a building is, whereas if you stand a 6-foot person up against the building, we can calculate sizes. So that's why I have blue stickers everywhere in lots of my pictures. And I think some of the stud farms thought their foals had getting some sort of disease on their hooves. All right, so I had to ask a number of questions. And what I wanted to ask is the phalangeal axis, in other words, the alignment of bones, the same as the hoof pastern axis? So when we look at a horse in life, and we look at conformation, and conformation, although sometimes that term is used quite widely, actually it really means to look at the silhouette of a horse. So we tend to judge a horse by its silhouette, and we certainly judge the hoof pastern axis. So we stand back from a horse, and it's probably about the earliest recorded way of looking at a horse. Xenophon wrote about buying horses about BC 300, somewhere around then. Some people say he plagiarized and I tend to agree with this, because if I tell you the author he plagiarised was Simon of Athens, you'd realise whose side I'd be on. But Simon of Athens had probably said it, but Xenophon made it famous about choosing a horse and paying attention to hoof angle and pastern. So 2,000 years later we still do that. Now in a mature horse, in the absence of laminitic conditions, we could tend to say, and experienced farriers would tend to know that what we see on the outside, we can predict what we've got on the inside. Radiographers hate me for saying that, but I think that's pretty much true. So I wanted to see if our foals were the same. And of course, radiography is a great way of testing, is what we've got on the inside related to what we've got on the outside. Now, my second question is, do hoof width and angle differences correlate? So, I would expect that most people here would say that where they have one hoof that is steeper than the other, there would be a tendency for that hoof capsule to be narrower. And you can debate that with me in the questions afterwards if you don't agree, but I think most find that to be true. And in fact, the only study that I know of, and I can't think of the name of the guy at the moment, it was done at Hartbury College in England, showed that where they were able to measure the hoof angles, where they were steeper, they tended to be the narrow hoof. And I wanted to know if our foals were the same. And then I just wanted to know what the hoof wall angle in paediatric foals was, because really we've got evidence from later on. Certainly McElraith and Anderson, or I should put it the other way around, Anderson and McElraith did a study, but they started at about 6 months of age. So I wanted to see what our foals looked like younger than that. So I took 22 foals. I would have liked to have had 30, but that's the way it goes. And I measured them in June on the same day. So this is their age in days. So you can see the youngest, I think, was 33 days old. And the oldest was probably about 10 weeks after that. So I measured left and right, and then I repeated the exercise in November. And so this is the dorsal hoof wall angle, so just this angle here, and we can see that we have a clear drop into the angle. In fact, it was quite remarkable. I think it's by about 5.5 degrees our foals drop in angle in that time. The other thing is, and I think I show it later on, I don't quite show it here, but my mean dorsal hoof wall angle of these young foals was 59.5 degrees. Now, I know of a couple of textbooks that will tell you that a club foot starts at 60 degrees. That would mean that almost half my foals had a club foot. I don't believe that. In fact, you can see the one club foot here, and here it is in November. So we found that the phalangeal axis was not the same as the hoof pastern axis. In other words, that you cannot make the same assumption with your foals that you can make with your older horses. And the thing that did surprise me is I could not correlate hoof width differences to hoof angle differences. Now in the November group, which were the same foals, there was a small correlation. So it may be that what we see in mature horses again has not yet manifested itself in our young paediatric foals. It's starting to by November, when we're getting foals that are 8, 10 months old, 7, 8, 9, 10 months old of age. But it hasn't yet really shown itself. So I think that probably shows that although the hoof is changing very rapidly in young foals, it's not changing that rapidly. And it hasn't to show itself. And I said there that the paediatric foals is 59.5 degrees, the mean average of those early foals. I combined the data with the Anderson McElraith, so this is my data here and here, and this is their data here and here. And so we see this beautiful curve. So obviously here at 24 months, our 2-year-olds, thoroughbreds, have an angle there of under 50 degrees. And here, at this age, they have, as I say, almost 60 degrees. Now, I didn't measure any earlier, but I have a feeling that actually at this point, if we could measure them all at a month, they probably actually go up in angle to start with here, and then they start this descent. And of course this descent probably carries on throughout the horse's life. If we look at a 10 or 15-year-old mare, despite our best intentions, they do seem to have continued to become a shallower hoof. So what about hoof shape changes? Again, Bidwell and Bowker, they remarked that the foal's foot is an inverted cone as compared to our mature horses, which are normally considered to be cone-shaped. And we can see an example of it here. This is a 3-month-old foal that appears wider at the coronary band than at the ground surface. And this has intrigued people before, but I think there's a simple explanation, and most farriers actually hit on it. This is the difference between, I would have to say, scientists sitting in a room discussing something, looking at a radiograph or a picture like that, and farriers. I read a paper where it was discussed, and they tried all sorts of things to work out why this should be like this and how it managed to resolve itself like this. Well, it's pretty simple, I think. I've shown you that the hoof wall thickens as the foal gets older. Or does it thicken all the way down its length, or does it thicken at the top and then go down? Of course it thickens at the top. So all we're really seeing is this hoof wall internally being thicker at the top. It does, sometimes it's more exaggerated than others, and it does cause concern for breeders. Having said that, where I slightly disagree with Bidwell and Bowker, I actually think foals are born with cylindrical hooves. In other words, they're neither an inverted cone nor a cone, but we're going to look at that on a video soon. I also wanted to find out how quickly a foal renews its hoof, because it's only ever been measured once, and that's in Lipizzaner horses, mature horses in Austria by Henrietta Josek, which just shows you how little we know about the horse. So I wanted to see how my foals, how quickly they renewed them. The reason I talked about growth rings there is that, of course, what is the biggest event in any animal's life? It's the day they're born. So we shouldn't be surprised that we have got a ring on each foot marking that day. And you can see from a side view and from a front-on view on this foal of about 2 months. And if we see it internally here, we can see that actually the day before the foal is born, the hoof wall is actually thicker than the day after. Undoubtedly the shock perhaps of being born, everything changes from being fed internally through the uterus, through the placenta in the uterus, to being outside, milk, and obviously quite rapidly taking grass. The other thing I think that happens is that this foal standing up, and I know I sound as if I'm a bit obsessed by it, an animal that stands up immediately at birth, I think this distal phalanx sinks slightly into the hoof. So it has a similarity with laminitis, and you can see that reflected if you can just about make out the horn tubule lines here, how they have a sudden change in direction and then it resolves itself later on. So it's a big shock to the system, and we see it there. But I was able to use this line to measure my hoof renewal. The other thing, of course, is that occasionally foals are not satisfied with the colour hoof that they're born with, and as you can see, the hoof changes colour and then it takes on a permanent darker colour. And where we have a flexural deformity, we can see that that's often the point where there is quite a radical change in angle, and you can see from that section it is a point of weakness, so we shouldn't be surprised that that's the point that the hoof bends most. Why should hoof renewal help? Well, by having an estimation of hoof renewal, we can give an estimation of healing time in cases like these, one where the heel's blown away by an infection, this one that was stepped on by the mare. So we can give an estimation of time. So I did a study using that foal hoof crease, and it has been published, and that showed that foals renew their hooves in 145 days plus or minus 15 days, and that was published almost 3 years ago now. So I wanted to see whether weanling yearlings took longer, and I had the opportunity to do that. So this was the one study where I went outside my pediatric fold. I had to do a number of calculations, and I had to mark the hoof because, of course, I didn't have this hoof line. And so there again we have that result. So what we found was that actually by the time they're weanling yearlings, and I started in December to give you some idea of the age and carried on through into the summer of the next year, they took 283 days, plus or minus 29. So quite a difference between our newborn foals to once they're weanling yearlings. So they're taking much longer to renew their hoof. And there we have Henrietta Jossex, so they're not thoroughbreds. Nobody has done it on the mature thoroughbred, which might just show how nerdish and boring I've become because I'm studying stuff that nobody else does. We looked at the speed of hoof growth, and I apologise to those of you that think in inches. My foals were growing at 0.43 millimetres a day. To put it in perspective, 25 mil is an inch. So in other words, they are growing by an amount that you can see quite easily every day. My apprentices cannot trim hoof that quickly, some of them. That was a joke, by the way. Sorry if you thought I was picking on my apprentices. It was the first joke about apprentices. All right. So, by the time we get to weanling yearlings, it's slowed considerably. So in other words, it's taking about 10 to 12 days to grow that much. So it's nearly half. And a mature horse is 20 mil. This is not my figures. This is taken from other studies, possibly non-thoroughbreds. But so we can see again that we've got this slowing, this very fast growth, and then slowing. So here's the question: why so fast? There has to be a reason why these foals are growing so fast, and I can only think of two reasons. One of them is this unique characteristic of the horse, that its middle digit, the only one it has left that it's walking on, is almost completely surrounded by hoof. Unlike our fingernail, which doesn't constrict our finger at all, the horse's digit is very constricted within there. Okay, you might say the back of the foot, or the boles of the heel is more elasticated, but that's still quite a constriction. So I actually think it's growing that fast to shed it. In the same way as a snake sheds its skin, it has to grow fast. This foal is doubling its weight in a month and trebling its weight in 2 months. There's a very rapid growth going on. And the only other reason I could think is you saw just how thin those newborn foals, how their hooves are. They're very thin. And in nature, they'd have to get up and follow their mother in the herd. Now, if they don't have a very thick hoof wall, that is not going to be very resistant to wear. So the only way to overcome that is to grow fast. So that's the only two reasons I can think for this, why hoof renewal is so quick in young foals and why the hoof grows so fast. Somebody else might come up with another thought. If we look at the distal phalanx changes, so 10-month-old fetus, 1 month before birth, almost looks like an arrowhead. There, a neonate, and if you look, and again this is millimetres, not inches, but they have been calibrated so they're coming out a proportionate size. And there at 4 months old you can see a really rapid change in size. But the other thing to note is the change in shape. It's very pointed shape that when we know this newborn foal's hooves are quite pointed, becoming this more rounded shape and obviously far bigger. So I used a pressure map because I wanted to know if loading affected hoof growth and is there a difference between healthy and, foals with an acquired flexural deformity, which is what AFD stands for. I have to come out of my show now and I have to run you this video because I thought you might want to see it. Pressure map. So I had the use of the university pressure map, which is usually used for human athletes to run over. If they told me once, they told me this thing was worth £25,000, so about $30,000. I told them I was going to try and find a foal that was worth as little as that to stand on it, just to try and get the message across about the value of them. Now, so we did just about 30 foals in all. I tried to get 20 at a control group. That was a convenient selection, so just the first 20 that I could, that Stud Farms had let me do this to. And we did it every month and measured their hoof growth at 3 sites around the hoof, so far more complex than what I'd done before. You'd think this little foal was trained to do this. I'd have to tell you it was quite remarkable how well behaved they were. The 2 that played up, we of course excluded because we couldn't get them injured. And there was only one stud farm that wouldn't let me use their acquired flexural deformity. So I was comparing them with, so I managed to get, I tried to get 10 foals, I got 9 in the end, foals with an acquired flexural deformity, to test those as well. So, it's typical of foals, as we've seen, to be born and to bear weight on the heels of their hooves. And this was the first one I did. It was about 2.5 weeks old. You can see the toes are not quite touching the ground, and this is where the toe should be. The bright red shows you where the greatest loading is. And then we looked at it a little bit later. So this was just for illustration, just for, for presentations like this. And we can see how the loading's changed. And again, this is very typical of young foals to load caudally, but also medially. Look, far more loading on the on the inside of the hoof than on the lateral outside. So again, that's very typical of the way they load. So we had this, and of course you have to change this into numeric data. And my goodness, it was mind-numbingly boring, actually. Everybody thinks that you can have a computer and you just push the button and it counts the numbers. Unfortunately, foals do this thing. They step on the pressure mat like that, or like that, or like that, or like that. And I need them in square to measure that, because I need to compare toe to heel, the inside or outside. So I actually had to do this by hand. I had to put those crosses on, I had to work out the orientation of the foot, and I had to count them. 30,000 individual numbers. And you get to the point when you do that sort of thing where you think, did I count that column? And then it's another 15 minutes work, and I can tell you. So, but nevertheless it was worth it in the end. So this is fairly typical of our foal with a flexural deformity, all right, one with a relatively severe one. This is typical of our foals that were not perceived to have any problem. So if we look at our control group, and you have to compare, look, medial with lateral, so medial with lateral, and dorsal with caudal, dorsal with caudal. So remember, I've made this a quadrant, and we're comparing the front of the hoof with the back of the hoof, and the two sides of the hoof. And so these figures should add up to 100% each time. These two, and these two, and these two, and these two. So this is the left fore, and this is the right fore. And you can see that loading is not even, and that medially, on both the left and the right fore, medially is greater than laterally. This was quite interesting in that I expected more loading caudally, but in fact on the right fores, the loading over the whole group, and this is the whole group from 1 month old to 4 months old, the loading was more at the toe, and it was always the right side. And there's been a lot of interest in the laterality of horses. In other words, as human beings, we are right-sided by about 8 to 1. Horses is about 75 to 25%. And that showed up really in some of these. So this is my control group. I don't want to call it healthy group, but it was just a random selection, no obvious problems. With our acquired flexural deformity group, from medial to lateral was the same. Look, very similar. But here the changes occur where the dorsum is loaded far more on the left fore, and on the right fore it is really loaded heavily. So from the point of view of hoof growth, and I was measuring the hoof growth, how much was descending the wall, and here we can see this pattern that's very, very similar on our control group, in that there is more hoof arriving at the ground on the lateral side. And I think most farriers will tell you, on a normal, everyday trim, that they would usually expect to remove more hoof on the lateral side, and that shows up in these figures here. But when we look at our acquired flexural deformity group, here we see that hoof growth is really restricted at the dorsum. Now, of course, most people would say that a club foot occurs because the heel is growing faster than the dorsum. The back is growing faster than the front. I have actually a feeling, looking at these figures, that actually it's that the toe is not growing as fast as the back, which is a different way around of looking at it. Overall, there was not a great deal of difference in the speed of growth between our two groups, but you can see regionally it was really quite different. So our conclusions were that dorsal hoof wall angle, and I didn't show you, I again checked that, and it was different between the two groups by about 2 degrees. There are regional differences in loading and hoof growth rate, so we could show that those were very different, and there was a correlation between the two. And so hoof shape is related to loading. The way our foals develop their hoof is related. I would have to say, when we look at the control group, and we can see that they're loading unevenly, of course what we don't know is the hoof pre-programmed to change shape, or is it purely responding to that uneven loading? And that was not part of my studies. But what I could say was that it clearly showed, because all along there were significant differences between the groups, that I was able to select foals with a flexural deformity and those without. Now you might think, well, how is that important? I'd have to say, when you do a scientific study, and I did one for my Bachelor of Science degree, it wasn't accepted for publication because I didn't measure where I saw the heels going up. So the normal thing with any scientific study is, can you measure it? Not do you do it by eye. We know most things in the horse world are by eye. So it was quite interesting to take what I'd selected by eye, but then compare it statistically and show that yeah, at times the eye does actually work, believe it or not. So I just want to reinforce this hoof shape changes, and that I believe the foal starts as a cylindrical shape, it becomes an inverted cone, and then probably well before 9 months, in fact probably at about 5 or 6 months, it starts to take on the shape that we expect. So now I'm going to show my second and only video, and the reason it's the Soward Pollitt video is that Professor Pollitt in Queensland, when I sent him the first paper that I published, he kindly sent me this video. It's a time-lapse video, and you will see of a horse that they took a photograph of from front on every week for the first year of its life, and put it together as a time-lapse video. It really shows a lot of stuff. It will show that foal hoof crease coming down. It will show a change in the pigment. You'll see this pristine hoof that is just one colour, and that changes. You will see it gets an injury at the corring band, and you'll see that grow out. And you'll see this hoof change from cylinder to inverted cone to cone. So there's a lot going on, and that's why I've given it that lead in. So here it goes. You can see it was non-coloured, and now it's coloured. There's the foal hoof crease and the pigment coming in. Every now and again a fly appears to show you it's an Australian video. And you can see that damage to the corring band and how it grows down. And now finally the hoof is starting to open out more to the shape that we expect. So remarkable changes, not just in size. And the thing that I'm trying to get across as well in this lecture is the change to the foal and its hoof is not just about size. There is an awful lot more going on. I would have to say that usually gets a great reception when I've been showing it, and I actually say it's hoof porn for farriers. So my wife is always knocking on my office door and saying, "Are you playing that video again, Simon?" So anyway, let's just go back to this. So we're just about at the end there, but I think it encapsulates so much of what I've been talking about, and it was wonderful for Chris Pollitt to let me have that. So before I forget, most of the work, although we've only published one paper, my thesis should come out 3 months after my university accepts it. I have to thank my two supervisors, Jamie Martin, who we've had to leave at home doing the washing up, because we don't let him travel, he doesn't travel too well. Sarah Hobbs, who's coming up to Cincinnati in a couple of days' time to speak at the International Hoof Care Summit. And my college, Myerscough College, and my university, Preston, for those of you who don't know, is somewhere up there in the northwest of England. You think England, it rains a lot. Newmarket's the driest place in England. It rains less than San Francisco. But if you want rain, you go to Preston. Preston is up there somewhere near Liverpool, and it's wet. I don't think I've ever been there when it hasn't been raining. So you have to be dedicated to do that. Now the reason I kept showing this picture of this little foal standing up is not because I hang about stud farms waiting for foals to be born. Mostly I don't see them until they're 2 weeks old, 3 weeks old, a month old. But because this little foal, there it is, a vulnerable little foal, probably 30 minutes old there, about to suckle off its mother. Its mother won the Breeders' Cup twice and came second once, so that was Ouija board. So there was great things expected of it, and 3 years later, this is it. It was named Australia, and it won the Epsom Derby about 3 years ago. And as I've told an audience of Australians, that is the only way that Australia will ever win the Epsom Derby. So, anyway. So just in conclusion, I've tried to show you this miracle of bioengineering and how it develops as a foal. We can see how rapid the expansion is. Hoof renewal is really quick, but it is slowing. Hoof growth is really quick, but it's slowing. And the hoof is changing shape, so it isn't just a question of this little foal's foot just getting bigger. It's undergoing quite a lot of changes. And you can see the loading changes, so the way it bears weight is changing, and it's changing whether it's a normal, healthy, typical foal or whether it's one with an acquired flexural deformity. And the hoof angle is declining, and that probably goes on the rest of the horse's life. But one thing we were able to show in our studies, and my study from a PhD, was just how early that process starts and just how steep that foal's hoof and pastern are at this age. And also the hoof wall structure changes. What we have as a foal is not what we've got as a mature horse. And of course there's questions to ask, as I say, is it pre-programmed or is it responding to the loading? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.